He called the police on Richard over a birthday gift, a gift I gave away. My son stood there, arms folded, watching two officers photograph the wine bottle he'd gifted me, now stolen property. My best friend, who drove me to every VA appointment since my wife died, was about to lose his pension over my son's twisted little trap. Brian hadn't just humiliated me in public, he'd weaponized sentiment, turned generosity into a setup. The bottle wasn't about heritage. It was insured for $200,000. I wasn't just framed as ungrateful. I was baited to ruin myself. But he didn't know I logged every gift, every receipt, every move. He handed me a bottle. I handed him a paper trail. Now the clock's ticking. In 90 days, I'll walk into that boardroom and burn the legacy he tried to fake. My name is Arthur Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. Every morning starts with black coffee on my porch, tending my roses, then walking to the Veterans Memorial where I donated the brass plaques and benches. My late wife Marion taught me to love gardening, and my Navy friend Richard Malloy still joins me there most days. The retirement community board seat I earned through 30 years of service means everything. Proven integrity, they said. My son Brian, a financial advisor who visits only at holidays, takes more pictures of his perfect life than he spends minutes talking to me. Something in his eyes has changed lately, that same gleam I saw in supply officers who fudged their numbers. Lucky for me, I kept every receipt, every ledger, every gift record since my Navy logistics days. But let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you about my 75th birthday dinner. Brian insisted on hosting it at Marcello's, that fancy Italian place where the waiters wear bow ties and everything's served under silver domes. You know the type, where they fold your napkin when you step away to use the restroom. The late afternoon sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across our private dining room. 20 guests filled the space, mostly neighbors from the retirement community and a few old Navy buddies. Richard sat to my right, quiet, but present as always, while Brian held court at the other end of the table. I couldn't help but notice how my son commanded the room's attention, dressed in one of those suits that probably cost more than my first car. Remember those old Chevys we used to drive? The ones where you could actually fix the engine yourself? But I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian announced, rising with that practiced smile he saves for his investment clients. Today we celebrate not just a birthday, but a legacy. The servers wheeled in a cart, and there it was. A wine bottle nestled in deep purple velvet, its label yellowed with age. Brian lifted it like he was handling the crown jewels. "Father," he said, "this bottle is over 100 years old. A testament to patience, to preservation." He went on about heritage and tradition, words that seemed to float above the table like soap bubbles, pretty, but somehow empty. Everyone raised their glasses in toast after toast, though I noticed Brian never actually opened the century-old bottle. Just as well, at my age, wine mostly gives me heartburn anyway. The thought of Richard crossed my mind, sitting there beside me, the same friend who'd driven me to every medical appointment since Marion passed. 10 years of friendship, no questions asked, no favors counted. "Richard," I said, picking up the velvet-cradled bottle, "this belongs with you, for all those early morning drives to the VA hospital, for being there." The words came naturally, straight from the heart. The room went quiet, that sudden kind of quiet that feels like a door slamming shut. Brian's smile stayed fixed in place, but something in his eyes turned to stone. "Father," he said, his voice dropping to that whisper that always reminded me of ice cracking, "this piece was meant to represent something, about meaning, about legacy." Silverware stopped clinking against plates. Mrs. Henderson from Unit 12B caught Mr. Peterson's eye, then quickly looked away. The air felt thick, like storm clouds gathering. I slipped the gift card into my jacket pocket. Force of habit, really. 40 years of keeping records teaches you to save everything. That card would go right into my ledger once I got home, right next to the Christmas checks and birthday cards I'd documented over the years. Brian recovered quickly, though. He was always good at that. Within minutes he had the empty velvet box in his hands, posing for photos with various guests. "Father's always been generous," he kept saying, but the words had an edge I couldn't quite place. You ever have a moment when you know something's wrong but can't put your finger on what? That's how I felt watching him work the room, smartphone cameras flashing like lightning before a storm. The bridge I thought we were building, that moment of father-son connection I'd hoped for, felt like it was crumbling before it even set. Maybe I'd misread the blueprints entirely. Driving home that evening, with Richard following in his car to make sure I got in safely, he always did that, bless him, I kept turning it over in my mind. Since when did a birthday gift come with unspoken rules? And why did it feel like I'd just failed some test I never knew I was taking? The gift card sat heavy in my pocket, waiting to be logged in my leather-bound ledger. Something told me I'd be glad for that record sooner rather than later. A week after the birthday dinner, my phone buzzed with messages before I'd even poured my morning coffee. You know that feeling when your stomach drops before you even know why? That's how those little notification dots looked to me, like storm warnings. "Did you really just give away Brian's gift?" Mrs. Henderson's text read. The poor boy spent a fortune. I set my coffee mug down carefully. The one Marion had painted with sailboats 20 years ago, back when her hands were steady enough for detail work. 3 more messages popped up, each one dancing around the same theme. How could I be so ungrateful? By 10 o'clock, I'd pulled on my cardigan and walked down to the community clubhouse. Something in my chest tightened when I saw the bulletin board. Right there between the Bridge Club schedule and the garden committee, notices was a printed thread from some luxury wine forum. Someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, had highlighted a section about investment-grade vintages and 6-figure valuations. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, "Such a shame when generosity is discarded so carelessly." I pulled out my phone and called Brian. It rang twice before clicking to voicemail. "Son, we need to talk about—" A text cut me off mid-message, just a link to an auction site. The same bottle, or one that looked like it, listed at a price that made my hands go cold. Below it, Brian had written, "Perhaps now you understand what you threw away. Have you ever watched dominoes fall? How one tips into another, faster and faster." That's what happened over the next few days. The Wednesday bridge group suddenly had a full table. The veterans' coffee morning changed locations without notifying me. Small things, but in a community this size, they spoke volumes. I heard whispers in the mailroom, saw conversations stop when I rounded corners, caught fragments like respect and values from committee members who used to seek my advice on community projects. That evening, I did what I've always done when the world stops making sense. I opened my ledger. The leather was smooth under my fingers as I documented each slight, each whisper, each turned back, dates, times, exact quotes when I had them. Old habits die hard, and right then, I was grateful for that. Later, at my desk, I tried drafting a statement for tomorrow's board luncheon. The words looked stiff on the page, defensive. I crumpled 3 attempts before setting down my pen. What was there to explain, really? That I'd given a gift to a friend who'd earned it. That loyalty meant more than auction prices. The more I rehearsed it in my head, the more I felt like a man trying to prove he wasn't guilty. And isn't that its own kind of admission? The room seemed to shrink around me as I sat there. The walls of respect and goodwill I'd built over decades were cracking, and all because of a bottle of wine I'd never even opened. My hands weren't quite steady as I made one final entry in the ledger. The gift card from the birthday dinner was still there, pressed between the pages like a dried flower. Tomorrow at the luncheon, they'd all be watching, waiting to see how I'd defend myself against charges that shouldn't need defending. Things have a way of revealing themselves, Marion used to say when I'd get worked up about something. But sitting there with my ledger open and my pen trembling slightly, I wondered whose truth would be revealed, and more importantly, whose truth would be believed. 3 days later, I spotted Brian near the Veterans Memorial, phone in hand as always. He was taking photos of himself against the polished granite, probably for one of those social media posts he loves so much. I'd been avoiding this conversation, but seeing him there, using the memorial I'd helped build as just another backdrop, something in me hardened. You ever notice how the toughest conversations happen on park benches? There's something about sitting side by side instead of face to face that makes truth easier to handle. "We need to talk about the wine," I said, settling beside him. The morning sun was warm on my neck, but my voice came out cool. "I'd like a straight answer about what's really going on here." Brian lowered his phone but didn't turn it off. His suit looked expensive. the kind of expensive that makes you wonder about someone's priorities. I think the community's reaction speaks for itself, Dad. Actions have consequences. Actions like what exactly? I kept my tone level, the way I used to during supply disputes in the Navy. Because from where I sit, showing gratitude to a friend shouldn't cost a man his reputation. A jogger passed by, and Brian waited until they were out of earshot. Maybe it's time people saw who you really are. He stood up, brushing invisible dust from his slacks. The carefully crafted image of the generous community pillar. The humble veteran who can do no wrong? Perhaps it needs updating. Before I could respond, he was already walking away, phone held high, recording himself against the morning sky. The casual cruelty of it, using the memorial I'd helped fund as a prop for his little performance, made my hands clench. I sat there a while longer, watching early birds hop across the path. Marion used to love feeding them, though the facility management always complained about it. The memory steadied me enough to head over to the administration building. Sarah Chen, our board secretary, was waiting in her office. The look on her face told me this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. "Arthur," she said, gesturing to a chair, "I wish this was a casual visit." She pulled out a folder. Fresh, manila crisp edges. Bad news always comes in clean folders. "The board has scheduled an extraordinary review of your honorary position." My throat went dry. "On what grounds? Recent events have raised concerns about—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "About alignment with community values. The vote will be held in exactly 3 months. Unless confidence in your standing can be restored by then." She didn't need to finish. I'd seen other honorary members stripped of their positions. It never ended well. Back home, I went straight to my study. The wall calendar hung there like always, marking time in neat little boxes. I circled a date 3 months out in red ink, writing 90 days beneath it. The numbers stared back at me, a countdown I never expected to face. I needed to talk to Richard. He'd been caught in the middle of this mess through no fault of his own. And now, his witness could matter more than ever. But first I had to get my facts straight about the gift, about that bottle, about everything. Opening my ledger, I started a new page. Wine provenance research. If Brian had documentation proving the bottle's value, he'd need to produce it. Authentication certificates, purchase records, anything to back up his claims. I'd learned in the Navy that paper trails don't lie, even when people do. The mail slot rattled, dropping today's stack onto the floor. Bills, advertisements, and a certified letter notice. Above it all, my answering machine blinked red. One new message, marked urgent. I pressed play, settling into my chair as an official voice filled the room. "This is Detective Morris with County Property Crimes. We're following up on a report regarding stolen vintage wine. Please contact our office immediately to discuss this matter." The message continued, but blood was already rushing in my ears. Stolen. The word hit like a physical blow. Through my window, I could see Brian's car pulling away from the curb, and I wondered if he'd planned this escalation all along. The sun was already dropping behind the sycamores when I pulled up to Richard's bungalow. You know that sinking feeling when you spot something that doesn't belong? That's what hit me when I saw the patrol car idling. Under the trees, its lights off but engine running. 2 officers were standing on Richard's front step, their postures stiff and official. Richard had answered his door in his old Navy sweatshirt, the one with the coffee stain that he refuses to throw away because his late wife gave it to him. Even from my car, I could see how small he looked between those uniforms. I got out quickly, my shoes crunching on the gravel. "Evening, officers. I'm Arthur Whitaker. That bottle they're asking about, it was my birthday gift." The younger officer turned, notebook already out. "Sir, we're investigating a reported theft of valuable property. The complainant states this item was misappropriated without consent." Misappropriated. The word tasted bitter. "I gave it to my friend as a gift. I have proof right here." I pulled out my phone, showing them the scanned birthday invitation and gift card. I'd photographed that night. Thank God for old habits. I'd documented everything just like always. The older officer studied the images, but shook his head. "We have a formal theft report on file, Mr. Whitaker. We'll need to photograph the item for verification." Richard's hands were shaking as he brought out the bottle. "You don't spend 30 years in civil service without knowing how fragile a pension can be. One ethics complaint, one hint of impropriety, That's all it takes to unravel decades of careful living. I'll bring all my documentation to the station first thing tomorrow, I said, watching them photograph the bottle from multiple angles. Receipt copies, witness statements, everything. Richard caught my eye. We both knew what was at stake. He'd driven me to every medical appointment since Marion passed, never asking for anything in return. Now, here he was, being treated like some common thief because of my son's twisted game. I glanced at my phone, checking the calendar app. 87 days until the board vote. Each day felt like a weight now, pressing down harder than the last. Standing in Richard's driveway, I pulled up Brian's number. Let it ring once, twice, all the way to voicemail, of course. He'd never had trouble avoiding difficult conversations. I'll need to set 2 alarms, I told Richard quietly. 1 for scanning, 1 for printing. I'll have everything ready before the station opens. The curtains twitched in the house next door. In a retirement community, news travels faster than light. I could already imagine the whispers. First he insults his son's generosity. Now the police are involved. I was locking my car when I heard it. 3 words that made my blood run cold. Custody for verification, the younger officer said, lifting an evidence box from the trunk. Richard and I both froze. They weren't just documenting the bottle, they were taking it. Every instinct screamed to object, to demand they leave it where it was. But 40 years of military and civilian service had taught me when to hold my tongue. The bottle disappeared into that box, with a finality that echoed across Richard's neat little lawn. My friend's face had gone grey, his good name and retirement piece hanging by a thread because I'd tried to show him kindness. "Mr. Malloy," the older officer said, "we'll contact you if we need any additional information." He said it like he was doing Richard a favor, like we should be grateful they weren't doing worse. I watched them drive away, their taillights bleeding red into the growing darkness. The sycamores threw long shadows across the yard where Richard and I stood, 2 old men caught in a younger man's cruel game. "I'm sorry, Richard," I said, my voice rough. "I never meant for any of this to touch you." I pulled into the police station parking lot before sunrise, my briefcase stuffed with every scrap of evidence I could gather. Birthday cards, photographs, witness contact information. 40 years in Navy logistics teaches you to keep your papers in order. But sometimes even perfect documentation can't stop a mudslide once it starts rolling. The desk sergeant directed me to a small interview room where Richard already sat waiting. He'd traded his comfortable sweater for a pressed shirt and tie, like he was facing a military review board. My stomach knotted seeing him there, straight-backed but tired, his coffee going cold in a paper cup. "Morning, Art," he said quietly. The fluorescent lights made every line in his face deeper. Before I could respond, a detective entered with a folder and a laptop. She was professionally polite but distant as she pulled up the complaint files. "We need to clarify some details about the transfer of this item," she began. "There's been a formal inquiry regarding potential ethics violations." My mouth went dry. Ethics violations? Given Mr. Malloy's position with civil service, any allegations of receiving misappropriated property must be thoroughly investigated. His pension status has been flagged for provisional review pending the outcome. Richard's shoulders sagged just slightly, but I caught it. 40 years of friendship lets you read the small tells. This was hitting him exactly where he was most vulnerable. I laid out my documentation carefully, speaking in measured tones despite the anger burning in my chest. The bottle was given to me at my birthday dinner. Here's the printed program listing all gifts presented. 23. Guests witnessed me passing it to Richard as a gesture of appreciation for years of friendship. The detective made notes, but her expression didn't change. "We'll need statements from those witnesses." The complainant alleges the item's value exceeds 6 figures, which elevates the severity significantly. 6 figures. The number hung in the air like poison gas. Even if we proved the gift was legitimate, just the suggestion of impropriety could haunt Richard's record permanently. The interview dragged on for another hour before they released us. Walking down that harsh fluorescent hallway, watching Richard's defeated posture, something inside me crumbled. I'd brought this storm down on my dearest friend because I'd tried to show gratitude, because I'd failed to see the trap in my own son's generosity. Back home, I drew every blind and locked every door. The morning sun felt like an accusation. I deleted 3 voicemails without listening and unplugged the phone. The thought of facing neighbors, of hearing their whispers or worse, their silence, made my skin crawl. You know that feeling when you can't stop picking at a wound? That's how I spent my nights, replaying every moment of that cursed dinner. The weight of the bottle in my hands, the velvet box, Brian's smile freezing into something hard and foreign. I'd thought I was building a bridge, but he'd been laying a minefield. I stopped going to water aerobics, skipped the morning coffee circle where I'd held court for 15 years. My calendar mocked me with its neat rows of days, counting down to the board vote. In the margin, I scratched rebuild standing with a shaking hand, then crossed out another empty day. Someone suggested I should apologize publicly, smooth things over. But the more I thought about it, the more twisted that idea became. An apology would mean admitting I'd done something wrong. It would validate Brian's lies, turn his manipulation into truth. I sat in my dark living room that night, lamp off, watching headlights sweep across the ceiling. The house felt too big, too quiet. Marion would have known what to do. She always saw through pretense, could spot a snake in fine clothes a mile away. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden in the late evening silence. I didn't move. Let them think I was asleep or out or dead. What was one more day of hiding from... The bell rang again, more insistent this time. Then a familiar voice called through the door, rough with urgency. "Art, open up. We need to talk." I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the lock. Through the peephole, Richard's weathered face looked determined, and I knew that expression. It was the same one he wore during Typhoon Prep in '73, when everyone else wanted to abandon ship. When I finally opened up, he didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped right in, switched on my living room lights, and fixed me with a steady gaze that cut through all my self-pity. "You're done hiding," he said flatly. "This isn't you, Art. Richard. I've already caused enough. Stow that talk." He settled into my kitchen chair like he was taking command of a bridge. "Remember what Commander Hayes drilled into us? Accountability isn't just owning mistakes. It's defending truth when lies try to bury it." The memory hit me hard. Ever notice how the important lessons stick with you decades later? I could almost smell the salt air and diesel from those long-ago briefings. "Coffee?" I asked, already reaching for the pot. "Some conversations need ritual." "Make it strong." Richard pulled out his tablet. "We're going to handle this the way we handled every supply chain dispute, with documentation and method." As I measured the grounds, Richard laid out his battle plan. "First, we need clear photos of that bottle, every angle, especially the serial numbers and seals. Then we cross-reference auction catalogs. If it's worth what Brian claims, there'll be a paper trail. And here's the key. We pull insurance filings. People filing six-figure claims tend to copy auction language word for word." My hands steadied as I poured our coffee. This was familiar territory, gathering facts, building evidence. I'd spent 30 years in Navy logistics doing exactly this. "My nephew took photos at the dinner," I said, pulling up his number. "He's always documenting everything for his social media." 10 minutes later, my printer hummed, spitting out crystal-clear shots of the bottle. The nephew's expensive camera had captured every detail. The label's gilt edges, the wax seal, even tiny scratches on the glass. "Perfect," Richard nodded, spreading the photos across my desk. "I'll start with auction archives. Focus on sales from the past 5 years. You track Brian's social media posts around the time he got the bottle. Look for anything about wine collections, specialty shops, or sudden interest in vintages." I pulled out a fresh notebook, one of those black and white composition books that always remind me of ship's logs. On the cover I wrote provenance in block letters. Something about seeing that word made everything feel more official, more controlled. "We need to organize this right," I said, taping 3 columns on my desk: gift, claim, proof. Old habits die hard, and right now, those habits felt like armor. Richard glanced up from his tablet. "Don't forget to document the board angle. They'll need advance notice if we're presenting evidence." He was right. I texted the secretary, requesting to pre-register documentation for upcoming review. "Will provide indexed materials by end of week." Her response came quickly. "Noted. Mid-month status check available if needed." I circled July 15th on my calendar. 2 weeks to gather initial findings. The tight deadline felt good, like having a mission again, instead of just waiting for judgment. We worked in comfortable silence, broken only by keyboard clicks and coffee refills. Around midnight, Richard straightened suddenly in his chair. "Art," he said, turning his tablet toward me. "Look at this lot number." I leaned closer to Richard's screen, squinting at an auction listing from 3 years ago. Same ornate label design, same gilded edges, but this wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. "Lot 247, confirmed counterfeit," Richard read aloud. "Part of a documented series using period-correct paper, but modern printing techniques." His finger traced down the catalogue entry. "Notice anything familiar about that label pattern?" My throat tightened. The swirls and flourishes matched our photos perfectly, right down to the tiny grape clusters in the corners. But it was the next line that made my hands go cold. "Cork branding inconsistent with pre-1930 production methods. You know that moment when scattered pieces suddenly form a picture you wish you'd never seen? That's what hit me as I pulled up the close-up shot of our bottle's cork. There it was, the same anachronistic brand mark that had exposed the other fakes. "There's more," Richard said quietly, switching to another tab. "Insurance filing from 3 days before your birthday dinner. The document loaded, crisp and damning. A policy rider for a heritage wine bottle, valued at $200,000. The policyholder's name stopped my breath. Brian Whitaker. "Jesus," I whispered. The word felt inadequate, but what do you say when you realize your own son set you up? The bottle wasn't a gift, it was bait. Give it away, and I'd look ungrateful. Keep it, and he'd claim theft. Either way, my reputation would crater while he collected on the policy. Remember when your kids were little and you'd catch them in some minor mischief? That mix of disappointment and love, knowing you had to correct them but wanting to protect them too? This felt like that, multiplied by decades and twisted into something darker. My son had orchestrated my public humiliation for an insurance payout. Richard spread the evidence across my desk: auction records, cork photos, policy documents, each piece another nail in the coffin of Brian's scheme, and my fatherly instincts warred with each other. Expose the truth or shield my son from consequences that would destroy the life he'd built. "The board votes in 2 weeks," Richard reminded me gently. "They need to know something." I pulled out 2 sheets of paper. On the first, I drafted a statement that buried our findings, accepting blame for a misunderstanding about the wine's significance. On the second, I laid out the facts: the counterfeit bottle, the insurance timing, the deliberate deception. Both statements sat there unsigned, while the refrigerator hummed in my quiet kitchen. Richard didn't push. He just sat with me, the way he had through Helen's funeral and all those lonely months after. Sometimes friendship means knowing when to let silence do the work. I picked up my provenance notebook, feeling the weight of every page we'd filled with evidence. The truth was right there in black and white. But truth and justice don't always walk hand in hand, do they? Especially when it's your own flesh and blood in the crosshairs. My pen hovered over the paper. In the margin, I wrote 3 words: "Tell the truth." Then I underlined them twice, each line feeling like a judgment. My phone buzzed. A text from the board secretary. "Hearing scheduled, July 8th, 2 p.m. Documentation due 48 hours prior." I stared at those words until they blurred. 10 days to decide. Between my reputation and my son's future. 10 days to choose between 2 kinds of betrayal. The refrigerator kept humming, indifferent to my crisis. Richard waited, solid as a ship's anchor. And somewhere in the night, my son was probably sleeping easily, never imagining his perfect plan could unravel. I touched the underlined words in my notebook. Tell the truth. Such a simple command. Such an impossible choice. Morning light streamed through my study window as I spread everything across my desk. You ever notice how evidence looks different in daylight? Each piece tells its own story, but together they paint a picture you can't unsee. I started with the auction screenshots, making sure every timestamp was visible in the corner. The catalogue entries lined up like dominoes, each one proving the bottle's markings matched known counterfeits. My hands were steady as I slipped them into plastic sleeves, but my chest felt like I was back in basic training, carrying a pack that got heavier with each step. Documentation must be sequential and indexed, the board secretary had told me over the phone. Original sources preferred, certified copies accepted. Her voice had that careful neutrality that comes from years of managing delicate situations. "We've reserved the Thursday slot 1 week before the deadline. That gives you 7 days to prepare," I finished. "And Richard's statement?" "Notarized with supporting exhibits clearly referenced. Remember those old Navy supply manifests? Everything had to be logged, cross-referenced, trackable. Funny how life circles back to lessons you learned decades ago." I laid out Richard's draft statement, each paragraph numbered, each exhibit tagged with a letter. The notary appointment was set for noon, just enough time to triple-check every detail. You know what's harder than gathering evidence against your own son? Trying to give him one last chance to explain himself. I dialed Brian's number, rehearsing an opener that wouldn't sound like an ambush. "Son, before this goes any further." The call went straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, my phone pinged with an email, just a forwarded signature block from Caldwell and Ross legal representatives and nothing else. My coffee had gone cold, but I barely noticed. The photos came next. The bottle from every angle, the cork's telltale markings, the insurance rider with its damning date stamp. Each one went into its own sleeve, crystal clear and undeniable. The whole truth, protected and preserved, ready to shatter whatever was left of my relationship with Brian. Walking to the notary's office, I stopped at the Veterans Memorial bench. The brass plaque caught the sunlight, names of better men than me etched in permanent honor. I ran my fingers over the smooth metal, remembering the first time I'd brought Brian here. He was maybe 7, full of questions about sacrifice and duty. When did those words lose their meaning for him? "Still keeping the faith," I murmured to the names. The old promise felt different now, heavier, like those supply packs from Basic. But integrity doesn't get lighter just because the load hurts to carry. Richard was waiting at the notary's office, his statement typed and ready. We didn't say much as she processed the documents. Some moments don't need words, just the quiet certainty that you're doing what needs to be done. Back home, I assembled the final packet. The index page listed every exhibit, every photo, every sworn statement. One by one, I checked them off. Auction records, A1, A7. Photographic evidence, B1, B4. Insurance documentation, C1, C2. Witness statement, D1. My pen moved down the list with military precision, each checkmark another step toward a truth I never wanted to tell. The evidence binder sat heavy in my hands. All those plastic sleeves, all those carefully organized papers. They looked so ordinary, like they couldn't possibly contain the end of something as fundamental as a father's trust in his son. I placed it by the front door, where it would wait for morning like a sentry at its post. My phone chimed once more. The hearing notice appeared in my inbox, stark and official. Community Board Special Session Date, July 1st, 2023. Time, 14 hours. Location, Main Hall, Status Review. Honorary position. I didn't need to read the rest. The time was set, the wheels in motion. In 7 days I would stand before my peers and unveil my son's deception. 7 days to prepare for a victory that would feel like defeat. The binder caught the evening light, its black cover reflecting nothing. Inside, protected by plastic and paper, lay the truth about legacy, about choices, about what we become when integrity meets its ultimate test. The boardroom hadn't changed since my first meeting 15 years ago. Same oak-paneled walls, same heavy curtains that never quite blocked the afternoon sun. But everything else felt different as Richard and I took our seats at the presentation table. You ever notice how some moments seem to stretch like taffy, while others snap past in a blur? This was both at once. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I'm here today with gratitude for your time and documentation that deserves oxygen over rumor." The words came naturally, like briefing my old supply chain supervisors. "Before we examine specifics, I'd like to acknowledge that my seat here has always been an honor, not a right." The board secretary's pen scratched against her notepad. Through the window, a mockingbird landed on the sill, tilted its head, and flew off. Funny, the details you notice when your world's about to shift. I opened the binder, its plastic sleeves catching the light. You each have an exhibit index in front of you. I'll direct your attention first to Section A, subsections 1 through 7. My finger traced the auction catalog entries. Note the identical label style here. I tapped the photo, and here. The comparison images drew their eyes. This particular design appears in a documented counterfeit series from 2019. Someone coughed. A chair squeaked. In the back row, Brian's jaw tightened. The cork branding, shown in Exhibit B3, presents a particular anachronism. The enlarged photo filled the projection screen. This marking style didn't exist before 1930. For a bottle claimed to be over a century old, that's rather impossible. Richard sat straight-backed beside me, his presence solid as a hull plate. I'd seen that same posture during his sworn testimony prep, unwavering despite everything the accusation had cost him. The timeline grows clearer when we examine Exhibit C. I slid the insurance documents forward. This policy rider, dated 3 days before my birthday dinner, insures a heritage bottle for $200,000. I let that sink in. I've highlighted Brian's social media posts from the same period, noting his repeated mentions of legacy and value. The room had that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm. You'll know what I mean if you've ever been at sea when the wind drops and the clouds gather. Mr. Malloy, I nodded to Richard. Would you please share your sworn statement regarding the events of April 15th? Richard stood, steady as always. The bottle was given to me during the birthday celebration, in full view of 30 guests. His voice carried the weight of his notarized testimony. Arthur presented it as a thank you for years of friendship and assistance. 2 weeks later, police officers appeared at my door, questioning me about stolen property. He described the pension review threat, the sleepless nights, the shadow cast over decades of service. I watched the board members' faces as Richard spoke. Some showed shock, others disappointment. A few just looked tired. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded, standing again, your confidence matters more than any family embarrassment. The truth here isn't comfortable, but it is documented. I slid the complete binder toward the center of the table. Every exhibit, every timeline entry, every statement can be verified. It's all indexed, cross-referenced, and certified where applicable. Opening my personal ledger, the one with 15 years of community records, I placed it beside the evidence binder. This habit of documentation, I learned it in Navy logistics. Every transaction, every gift, every donation, all recorded. Anyone here is welcome to examine both the evidence and my personal records. The leather chair creaked as I sat back down, hands folded on the table. The board chair adjusted her glasses, looking toward the door where Brian stood with a man in an expensive suit. Mr. Brian Whitaker, she said, would you care to respond to these materials? The attorney leaned close to Brian's ear, whispering urgently. Brian's face had lost its usual camera-ready composure. The chair cleared her throat. Given the nature of the evidence presented, I believe a 15-minute recess is in order. She tapped her gavel once. We'll reconvene at 3:45. The recess stretched like an ocean horizon. I stood in the corridor, my eyes fixed on that framed photo from the groundbreaking ceremony 12 years ago. There I was, younger but still grey-haired, shovel in hand, writing the first check that would help build this place. Back then, everything seemed simpler. Do right, give back, keep your word. You ever notice how memory plays tricks with time? That ceremony felt both yesterday and a lifetime ago as I traced the gilt frame's edge with my fingertip. The glass needed cleaning. I made a mental note to mention it to maintenance, then caught myself planning ahead like nothing had changed. Behind the boardroom's heavy door, voices rose and fell like waves against a seawall. Once, I caught Brian's tone, sharp, insistent, followed by what sounded like his lawyer trying to dial him back. The clock on the wall ticked past 3:45, then 4. My legs were stiff from standing, but I couldn't bring myself to sit in one of those corridor chairs. Navy habit, I suppose. Stand your watch, stay alert. Richard had stepped outside for air, but I knew he'd be back. That's the thing about true friends. They show up, they stay put, they weather the storm with you. When the door finally opened, he materialized at my shoulder like he'd never left. The board will reconvene, the secretary announced, her voice carrying that careful neutrality I recognized from my own years of difficult meetings. We filed back in. The afternoon sun had shifted, throwing longer shadows across the polished table. The chair adjusted her reading glasses, shuffling papers with deliberate movements. Brian and his lawyer had taken seats near the back. Though I noticed the lawyer's briefcase was now open, papers spread before him. After reviewing the materials presented, the chair began, her tone measured but firm. We have reached several preliminary findings. She lifted a single sheet. First, regarding the bottle's provenance, the documentation provided by Mr. Arthur Whitaker raises significant questions about authenticity. The claimed century-old origin appears unsupported by physical evidence and historical records. My breath came slow and steady, though my hands wanted to shake. I'd learned long ago, in moments of truth, still waters serve best. Second, she continued, the theft allegation appears unfounded, given multiple witness statements confirming a public gift transfer. She glanced toward Richard. The board considers this matter closed. I felt Richard's shoulder brush mine, the smallest gesture of support, but it steadied me like a harbor bollard in rough seas. Additionally, the chair's voice took on a more formal tone, given the nature of the evidence presented regarding insurance matters, the board has submitted an external notice to the relevant carrier for their review. There it was, the ripple that would become a wave. I did some quick math in my head. Insurance fraud investigations, potential criminal, charges, asset freezes. Poor Brian. He'd tried to bury me but had dug his own pit instead. No father wants to watch his son fall, even when the fall is earned. Madam Chair, I kept my voice level, could you clarify the timetable for next steps? She nodded, appreciating the return to procedure. The board will hold a formal vote next Tuesday regarding your honorary seat. Written findings will be circulated to all parties within 48 hours. A pause. We'll need signed receipts for those documents. Of course, I said, gathering the evidence binder. Thank you for your time and consideration. Brian wouldn't meet my eyes as I passed his row. His lawyer was already on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. The sun hit Brian's face through the window, and for a moment I saw him at 5 years old, caught in his first real lie about a broken vase. Same flush across his cheeks, same trapped look. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn, I suppose. The parking lot felt too bright after the boardroom's filtered light. Richard had offered to drive, but I needed the familiar grip of my own steering wheel. As I reached for my keys, my phone buzzed. Blocked number. This is an automated notice regarding policy verification, a recorded voice announced. Your claim number. I ended the call, knowing there would be many more. The dominoes were falling now and no one could stop their cascade. The next morning hit like a hangover, though I hadn't touched a drop. My old alarm clock, the kind with actual hands, not those digital numbers, showed 6:15 when the first call came in. Blocked number again, but this time when I answered, it was a real person, an insurance adjuster requesting Brian's direct line regarding material misrepresentation in the policy filing dated. I gave them his office number. What else could I do? You ever notice how fast news travels in a retirement community? By 8, my morning coffee group had shifted their usual spots, clustering around the far end of the counter. Familiar faces suddenly found their phones fascinating whenever I walked past, but this time the whispers carried a different tone, less accusation, more shock. Funny how truth changes the pitch of gossip. Did you see the notice? Mrs. Henderson finally broke the ice, sliding her tablet across the counter. There it was in black and white, a public filing showing Brian's accounts had been frozen pending investigation. The legal language was dry as dust, but between the lines I read the collapse of everything he'd built his image on. Assets subject to review. Material concerns. Temporary restriction. Each phrase felt like another. Brick hitting bottom. Remember those Navy mornings when fog would roll in so thick you couldn't see the bow from the stern? That's how it felt walking home. Everything familiar turned strange and muted. My phone buzzed twice more. First, the board secretary confirming tomorrow afternoon's vote, then Richard asking if I wanted company while I reviewed my testimony one last time. You know what gets me about betrayal? It's not the knife in your back. It's watching someone you love sharpen it. Every receipt I'd saved, every detail I'd documented, they weren't weapons until Brian made them so. Now each piece of paper carried the weight of his choices, not mine. Around 2, I drove over to Richard's place. His coffee's always been terrible. Navy strong, he calls it. But today I needed that bitter anchor. Let's go through it again, he said, spreading the papers across his kitchen table. Dates first, then sequence. We spent an hour matching timestamps to testimonies, double-checking every claim against hard evidence. Richard's pension paperwork sat in a neat stack nearby, a reminder of what Brian's scheme had nearly cost. Your memory's sharp as ever. Richard said finally, gathering the pages. "Board won't have any questions you can't answer." The sun was settling toward the hills when I pulled into my driveway. Fall comes earlier these days, seems like. Or maybe time just moves differently when you're watching your world reshape itself. There was an envelope on my welcome mat, hand-addressed, no return. Inside, I found a single note, clipped from what looked like church bulletin paper. "Forgive him, he's your son." Funny thing about advice, it often tells you more about who's giving it than who needs it. I carried the note to my study, opened the ledger where this whole story began and slipped it between the pages. Another piece of evidence, another mark in the record of what silence costs. My phone pinged one last time as I was laying out my blazer for tomorrow's vote. The board's final agenda, time-stamped and formal. I set my evidence binder by the front door, right where I could grab it in the morning. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trellis I'd built the summer Ellen passed. The empty vine. Stems tapped against the windows like somebody trying to get my attention. But I'd already made my choice. Truth doesn't get easier to tell just because you love the person it hurts. I stood there in the growing dark, listening to those vine stems whisper. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing its own kind of storm. For now, all I could do was weather this night, one tick of the clock at a time. Ever notice how a room feels different when justice is about to be served? The board chamber had that weight to it, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood at the podium, hands steady on its edges, as Chairman Martinez called for the vote. "All those in favor of restoring Mr. Whitaker's honorary seat, please raise your hands." You could have heard a pin drop in that moment. Then, like a slow wave, every hand in the room went up. Not a single abstention, not one vote against. The unanimous show of support hit me harder than I'd expected, made my throat tight in a way Navy men aren't supposed to admit to. "Motion carries," Martinez announced, his voice warm. "Mr. Whitaker's seat is formally restored, effective immediately." I nodded my thanks, not trusting my voice just then. Richard caught my eye from the back row and gave me that slight chin lift we'd perfected during our service years. In that simple gesture, I read everything. Solidarity, vindication, the power of standing firm when truth's on your side. The chairman cleared his throat. "There are 2 additional matters for the record." He lifted a paper. "First, given the evidence presented, this board has referred the insurance policy matter to appropriate authorities for review of potential fraud." My chest tightened. Even knowing it was coming, hearing it made official still felt like taking a body blow. "Second," he continued, "the community newsletter will publish a notice of censure regarding the false allegations that were circulated against Mr. Whitaker." And there it was, Brian's complete undoing, spelled out in black and white. The legal system would handle the insurance fraud, while the social circle he'd worked so hard to impress would know exactly what he'd tried to do to his own father. Sometimes justice comes with a balance sheet, all its own. I gathered my papers slowly, accepting handshakes and quiet congratulations as the room cleared. Richard waited by the door, patient as always. "Buy you a coffee," he offered. I shook my head. "Think I need some quiet time with my garden first." But tomorrow, he understood. Always has. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step carrying the weight of what had just happened. Victory doesn't always taste the way you expect it to. Sometimes it's bittersweet, like medicine you know you need but wish you didn't. I'd stopped at Marshall's Garden Center earlier in the week, picked out a young grapevine, something I'd been meaning to do since Ellen passed. Funny how we put off these small promises to ourselves until life forces our hand. The vine sat waiting in its nursery pot by the back steps, green tendrils already reaching for something to climb. I gathered my tools. Trowel, garden fork, the old kneeling pad Ellen had quilted from worn-out jeans. Some habits of care you never forget. The soil turned easily near the trellis, good earth, the kind that remembers what it's meant to nurture. I worked it gently, making space for new roots to spread. Ever notice how therapeutic it is getting your hands in dirt, like the ground itself draws out whatever's weighing on your heart? I eased the vine from its pot, careful not to disturb the root ball. Young plants are delicate things, need a gentle touch to take hold. The roots looked healthy, eager almost, as I settled them into their new home. Good stock usually shows its quality early on. Pressing soil around the base, I couldn't help but think about foundations. How what you build your life on matters more than what you display to the world. I let the hose run slow, watching water darken the earth in expanding circles. A single tendril caught the late afternoon light, already reaching for the trellis bars. Standing there, watching that tiny vine prepare to climb, I felt something inside me settle. An old Navy buddy once told me something I've never forgotten. Respect outlives riches. Looking at that young plant taking hold in honest soil, I knew he'd been right all along.